Hey guys, and welcome back to Dan's Pro Shop, where everything's made up and the instructions actually matter this time because we're doing engine work, so we need those clearances. But hey, welcome to part 2 of the Honda ATC 250es job here. We're going to be doing a valve adjustment on this engine because the previous video, which I'll link right here, I mentioned we got a little ticking in the top end, which tells me these valves need adjusted. So, before we get going here, I'm going to let you guys know you may get some background hooping and hollering because I'm playing dad today and the boys are out here in the garage with me. So you might get a little extra something in the background and some noise, but hey, they're kids. That's what they do. So let's get into this thing and see what's going on today. So as you guys can see, we got the Honda up here on the lift, and I've already started disassembling a lot of stuff because I'm willing to bet if you clicked on this video, you probably have one of these because I don't know why you would particularly view this unless you wanted to do this job. Hey, unless you're just looking for entertainment, then cool. Good for you, man. I love figuring out how to use stuff. So we've removed the seat and the fuel tank, which honestly, Will's happy about it. But the seat comes off just like any other quad. There's just a latch. And then the fuel tank, you take the fuel line off of the petcock, one 10mm bolt, and the whole thing just pulls off. And one of the coolest things about these Honda ATC three-wheelers, this whole back clip folds up like a hood. So you take out two 13mm bolts. Check this out. The whole thing goes out of your way. So you have access to the entire subframe, the exhaust, the battery, the airbox, everything. But this is just really cool. I mean, two bolts, and you take the seat off, and then you got all of this room. So, the focus of today's video, why we removed the fuel tank, is because we're digging into the head for the exhaust and the intake valve. And you see on the head here, there's these two wee little valve covers. The one in the front is relatively better, easy to get to. That's the exhaust valve. On the back is the intake that's right under the backbone here, the frame, which I feel like that's going to be a real bear. But hey, we're going to do it. So let's start taking these caps off and see what's in the top end of this engine. And Will just hit the camera, so that's good for you. So like I mentioned in the previous video, since this thing is an import, every fastener on this thing is metric. So this valve cover up here is a 10mm. We'll go ahead and rip this thing off. I tell you, you seen me fumble there? This is one of these Pittsburgh ratchets from Harbor Freight. Boy, is this a snap-on knockoff if I've ever seen one. But the thing that really throws me for a loop is the lever is exactly opposite of a snap-on ratchet. So, like, I always fumble with this thing because I end up going the wrong way. Anyway, we'll just keep going with this. Take these two bolts out of the valve cover on the exhaust valve. And Will's beating the crap out of the camera stand right now if you guys can't hear and or see that. But hey, I love having the boys in the garage. You know, just having them around this stuff, exposing them to it, yeah, he likes it. So now that I have the bolts pretty much out, I'm just going to go ahead and pry up on this cap just a little bit. There you go. Now bear in mind, all this stuff's aluminum. Be careful with it. And replacement parts for these things are almost non-existent. So, we'll take this up. Oh, and you see that O-ring is sticking. Be careful. Do not tear this O-ring. Chances of you getting a new one, slim to none. Be careful. Cool. We got the O-ring out in one piece. That is a huge relief. But yeah, that's just the inside of the valve cover on this engine. And since we're here with the tools, let's just go ahead and rip off the other valve cover while we're in here. This one is significantly more hidden away, so you're going to have to use a little bit of patience with this one to get to it. Get on the other side here, take off this other bolt. And of course, there's a wiring harness on this side that's like right in the way. Alright, we got her busted loose. And remove the valve cover. Same thing. Watch that O-ring. We need to preserve that thing. And do your best to keep all the gunk out of the top end of the motor here. So we'll go ahead and put that valve cover off to the side and dig into this thing. Now we're here on the left side of the machine here, on the shifter side. This cap right here is for the timing. So we need to make sure that this thing is top dead center compression whenever we're doing this, so that both rockers are loose and we have the engine in the correct orientation to set this slack properly. So we need to get a large flathead screwdriver and simply take this cap off. Now we can rotate the engine and look for the timing mark that it calls out in the book. I'll show you that picture just so you guys know what's up. Now, like I mentioned before in the previous video, Clymer manual for these machines available on Amazon. I will link it down in the description in case you're interested. Now here in lubrication and maintenance, you see here it points out this cap here, the rotor and the timing cap. This one, it tells you to take the rotor off so you can spin the engine over manually with a wrench or a ratchet or whatever, but we already have the side covers taken off here, so we can just use the kicker on the other side, and there's really no reason to mess with that. So we're taking this cap off, and what we're looking for is a timing mark on the inside of this. On the inside of the engine, we're looking for this mark with a little T on it, and it needs to line up with the indexing mark on the side of the case. So we're going to spin the engine over until we have this situation here, which will guarantee us that we are top dead center compression and we're good to adjust the valves. Now, I know this is going to be about next to impossible to see, but I'm going to try to zoom in. I don't know. I'm going to do my best to get it done and then show you guys physically what's happening versus the book. Now, the book also recommends pulling the spark plug so you can spin this thing over a lot easier without compression. That's totally up to you whether you want to or not. Okay guys, we're going with plan B here. You see that I took the cap off anyway. I'm using a ratchet to spin over the crank. So, I was staring at this thing till the cows come home and I can't find something that is definitively that T mark. So, I removed the spark plug, not for the reason that I mentioned earlier to relieve compression. It's so I can manually see when the piston is at top dead center. I use this wee little plastic thing that I had laying in the toolbox. Use something soft that's not going to jam up your cylinder. Use your head when you're doing this. So since we have the valve covers off, we have access to the rockers. Whenever you put this thing, anything down the spark plug hole, rotate the engine. You'll see that this thing goes up and down with the piston. Whenever it comes all the way up, there we go. I can tell that I'm on the top of that. And then, with a 4-stroke engine, the only 2 times that thing is at the top is exhaust and compression. And since we're looking for top dead center compression, both valves need to be loose. You hear that? That's the exhaust valve rocking. It's loose. That's the intake valve rocking. It's loose. Now, just to show you guys, if I go back down and spin this thing another, so there's the bottom of the stroke. It's coming back up. There we go. That is top center again. But, see, the exhaust valve is closed, or it's open. The exhaust valve is tight. So that's telling me that the piston is all the way up on the exhaust stroke. That's not what we want. We'll go back down and do this again. Send the piston all the way back up the top dead center. There it is, right there. I can feel it, that it's right at the crest and starting to go back down. And we recheck our valves. Exhaust is loose, intake is loose. That tells me for sure that this engine is top dead center compression. And I tell you what, I am such a schmuck. Now that I went through all that and found it manually, look at that right there. There is most definitely a notch right there I don't know if it's a T, but there's definitely a notch that lines up with the threads in that hole. Maybe if I'd have been more patient, I just would have found it. But hey, that's an extra little tidbit. Now you guys know how to find TDC without a timing mark. So now we have the engine in the position that we need it to be in. Let's go ahead and check the actual value for clearance here. So in the book, it tells us right here, valve clearance, intake and exhaust. 250cc engine, 0.003 of an inch. So we're going to grab a feeler gauge and you do this just like you would adjust any other valve. So guys, I just dug through my feeler gauge kit, and every single one that I have that is smaller than 0.008 is just crinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil. So please pause for technical difficulties while I source myself a new one. Alrighty campers, we're back in business. Thanks to my good buddy Paul, he dropped off one on his way home from work, so we're in it. You can tell here, we got a 0.003 feeler gauge. Nice and bendy because it's so thin. So we're going to be able to shove this thing in between the rocker and the top of the valve and adjust these things properly. So if you see in the book there, it tells you that this takes a specialty tool to do this, because in 1985, the top of the stud here for the adjuster on the rocker is a weird little square. So it doesn't take like a regular screwdriver, a flathead, or like even a wrench or anything. You're supposed to have this fancy specialty tool. But luckily, we have a fancy specialty tool. Honestly, once you release that jam nut, it doesn't take anything to spin that stud. So just get creative and do what you need to do. And the nut that holds this thing together, the adjusting nut, it's just a 10 mil. So get in there with a wrench, loosen that jam nut, and then we can adjust that stud with our fancy specialty tool to our 0.003 gap. So I got you guys over on the other side of the lift so you can better see what's going on. My fat head is going to be in the way for most of this. So now that we for sure have the engine at top dead center compression, we can go ahead and adjust these valves. Step one, take your 10 millimeter here and crack loose that adjusting nut on the rocker. Boy howdy, that thing's tight. But luckily, with this exhaust one, we can get it with a ratchet. Loosen up that adjusting nut, take our 0.003 feeler gauge, and we can slide it in there underneath the rocker and in between the top of the valve. Now it's nice enough, we can even spin this with our fingers. And you want to get just a little bit of drag. Like you don't want that thing to get stuck, but you want it to be snug. Because if it's too tight, it'll want to hold the valve open. And that is just as bad as having a misadjusted one. So you guys can hear that? That is the friction of that feeler gauge in between the rocker and the top of the valve. And that is just about freaking perfect. So we'll go ahead and hold everything in that position and lock down that adjusting nut. All right, I'll see if I can't bring you guys in here a little bit closer so you can actually see what I'm looking at. So here we have the exhaust valve rocker, the adjusting nut, and that weird square stud that we're trying to use for the actual clearance. So take your 0.003 feeler gauge and get it in between that rocker and the top of the valve. This is what we're looking for. This is an absolutely perfectly adjusted valve. Now we are going to do that exact same thing for the intake valve, but this is going to be significantly more difficult to get to. So we're doing the exact same thing here on the other valve. I know you guys probably can't see most of this, but I am having trouble seeing it also. So I have the feeler gauge in there. I can tell that it's a little loose. It just kind of falls in. So we're going to do that exact same thing. Get in there with a 10 mil wrench. Tell you what, we might even be able to fit the ratchet in here. Loosen up that jam nut. There you go. I don't know if you've heard that crack loose. Now we can get our feeler gauge in here and in between that stud and the top of the valve, and adjust that stud down to where that feeler gauge is just scraping in and out of there. This one is a little bit of a bear to get to, but have some patience. Got all the time in the world, especially when you're dealing with engine components. This is something you do not want to rush. See right there, I got a little bit too tight, so we're going to loosen it up just a smidge. Reinsert our feeler gauge. Oh, that's nice. Just a wee little bit of drag. That's exactly what we're looking for. Now we can get in here with our 10 mil wrench, tighten it down, and recheck and make sure that that stud did not move while we were tightening the jam nut. Crank down on that thing once more. Make sure that jam nut is good and tight so this stud does not move from where we set it. Now when reinstalling the valve covers, make sure the mating surface for this O-ring is good and clean, because this will be a guaranteed source of an oil leak if you don't take care of this now. Make sure that the O-ring is good and clean. Put the cap back on there. We'll slide the hardware back into place. Now, like I mentioned before, these back ones are kind of miserable to get to. So you got to use your God-given tools to get into most of this. But once you have them wound down 90% of the way, then you have just enough room that you can sneak a ratchet wrench in there. Tighten these things down and send them home. Now you're going to want to alternate this. Don't crank down one like crazy before you get to the other. Do one then the other, one then the other. Go back and forth until you're happy with that. Now I know I can pretty much guarantee you that there is a torque spec for this. But on the same note, I know there is no way I'm going to get a torque wrench in there. So we are just going to go with what we know and what it feels like. Because if you've done this long enough, you know when a bolt going into an aluminum hole is tight enough. See, Will knows too. We'll do this exact same thing with the exhaust valve cover. Throw this back on. Make sure the surface is good and clean. Make sure the O-ring is good and clean. Go ahead and start our hardware by hand. Both sides. Run it down until it makes contact with the top of the valve cover. Take our wrench. Snug them down. And that's all she wrote. Sweet, we now have the valves adjusted properly, reinstalled the valve covers, so all that's left is to put this thing back together. We'll start by putting the spark plug back in here. Same thing like everything else we've done here. Start it by hand. This stuff is aluminum. Be careful, be delicate with it. Once you get her down, then you can crank it. I'm sure that you guys have installed a spark plug before. You know, don't kill this thing. Go until the crush washer crushes, get snug, and stop. The last thing you ever want to do is strip a spark plug in a head. Ta-da. Now obviously we don't need it here anymore, so let's go ahead and install our inspection covers. Make sure we keep all that gunk and everything out of there. So we have the rotor cover and the timing cover. Once those are good and snug, now we can go ahead and put the rest of the bike together. Alright, I know you guys are a little far away, but I got you up on the table and out of Wilson range because he keeps on slamming into the tripod and giving you guys a bit of an earthquake. So you'll get like an overview of me just putting this thing back together. Honestly, it takes no time. So if you're wondering how to take it apart, just do this exact same thing in reverse. There's nothing to it. So the first thing you're going to want to do, take your fuel tank, jam her back on there. There is nothing to this process, I'm telling you. There is just 2 rubber mounts up front that this thing indexes into. You'll feel it. There is nothing to it. And once she is in all the way, it will drop into this stud back here underneath the seat. I just check both sides to make sure those rubber mounts are in fully and everything. Just make sure that you got it in all the way. So once you have the tank indexed and fully inserted, then this stud back here on the back, it just takes that 10 mil bolt, throw it back in. And that's it. Your tank's on. Well, I guess one last thing. We need to hook up the fuel line to the petcock on the other side, but that's a given. You'll figure it out real quick whenever you start it, and it doesn't start. Now, I know you guys can't see it, but I'm putting a rubber hose onto the petcock. Trust me. Just tighten down the hose clamp, and that's it. And once you've got the fuel tank on, the line connected, everything, close the trunk. 2 13 mil bolts. You're welcome, Joe. 1 on either side here. And simply run them down. And that locks down this whole thing from pivoting. The last step, we'll throw the seat on here. And hey, a shout out to YouTube here. I know parts for this thing are difficult to get. I am looking for a new seat pan for this, because if you can tell, the nose here is pretty beat up, and it's kind of busted in the corners. It won't hold a staple anymore. So if you have a seat pan for a 1985 Honda ATC 250es, leave a comment. Find me on Facebook. Whatever you need to do, let me know. I'm in the market. This one's okay. It's got a new seat cover on it. Looks nice, but I would really like to have a new seat pan for this thing. Make sure all the studs are in the right place. Seat on. The very last thing we got to do is put the side covers on. They're just the beauty little things that make it look nice. And if you guys don't know, the side cover on this thing covers the kicker. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, it makes it look a lot nicer. But God forbid you're on the trail or something and your battery dies, your battery falls out, whatever. But you need to be able to remove that side cover to use the kicker. So leave a Phillips head screwdriver in the toolbox or carry a Leatherman or something, because chances are you're probably going to need access to this kicker at some point whenever you're not in the shop. So, pro tip there. Well, guys, that about wraps this one up. Hopefully this helps somebody out there, because like I've said before, there isn't much information on these things. So if you have one, you're kind of on your own unless you stumble across stuff like this. And honestly, the manual, I know I am Mr. Not Follow Instruction, but for stuff as important as doing engine work, you need clearances, you need torque specs, you need information. So pick one of these things up. I promise, it'll be a link in the description. So hopefully somebody gets something out of this, and we will see you guys next time.